In this lesson, we're going to talk about the Ansible configuration file. Ansible config is placed by default in the Etsy Ansible directory. However, you can also place an Ansible config file in the following places: as an environment variable, which in this case I have it set to the temp directory, in the current directory, which in this case is the My Project directory, in the home directory, and lastly, in the default location of Etsy Ansible. Now, just like with my host file, I typically place an Ansible config file right alongside my main playbook. This means that this file will take precedent over any Ansible config files placed in either the home directory or in the default location of Etsy Ansible. Precedence in Ansible is a big concept, and we're going to be exploring this more in a future lesson. Now, because there are so many parameters inside this configuration file, I'm only going to cover a few of them. As new users to Ansible are probably okay to just leave the defaults of this file and only change the values if necessary. There are 7 sections in the Ansible config file, and they cover everything from general defaults to accelerated mode and open SSH settings. In this lesson, we're only going to discuss a few parameters from the general default setting. However, we will delve into privilege escalation in a later lesson, which is also a section in this file. Now, looking at the configuration file, you'll notice that many of the default parameters are commented out. So most of the time, you really don't have to interact with this file if you don't want to, but the following parameters might be useful to you if you're interested in exploring this file. So to start with, any of the ask pass parameters are going to allow you to input a password at runtime. So this is super useful if you don't want to keep password information in VARS files and would rather be prompted to input the password when you run your playbook. Our second setting is the fork setting. By default, this is set to 5, and this controls how many parallel processes are spawned against your remote hosts. Raising this to a higher number is useful if you're running a playbook against a large number of hosts because it allows your playbook to complete faster. Now, our inventory is relatively small, so we're actually going to leave this as is and not even uncommented out. Okay, so the next setting is the library setting. This is the default path that Ansible uses to look for modules, and this can be modified to point to custom modules or to point to a devel version of a module that you're testing maybe new functionality with. The next setting is probably my most favorite, and that's the no cows parameter. If you uncomment the no cows parameter, then you're going to get a treat when you run your playbook. I have it set to 0, which means that now my playbook is going to be displayed an awesome cow say. And this is kind of the fun part of running playbooks. So I definitely recommend uncommenting this and having cow say in your playbooks. It's just fun, and we'll see it in a future lesson. The next one is the private key file parameter. And in our previous lesson, we actually supplied our path to our PEM file so that we're able to connect to our EC2 instance. Moving on, we now have the remote underscore wildcard setting. So that's remote underscore user, port, temp. And most of the time, these are usually set in your inventory file or in VARS files along with your playbook, but you can set them in the Ansible config file as well. If I were to uncomment this particular parameter, that would mean that I would be connecting to my hosts as root user by default. The next parameter is the timeout setting. And this controls the maximum amount of time to wait for an SSH connection to happen. So this may actually be worth ratcheting up in long running tasks. Okay, lastly, transport. The transport parameter by default is set to smart, which will use SSH based connection if the open SSH versions on the target hosts are new enough. But if they're not, and I would say probably anything below 6 would not be new enough, you should explicitly set this to Paramiko. Now, this, of course, is only 12 or so settings out of many in the configuration file, so it may be worth it to familiarize yourself with some of the other parameters if you have a specific use case.